instance, if you're running for office in Ohio, it shouldn't be possible for some Jewish philanthropist in California to give your opposing candidate $2 million to run his campaign. But this isn't going to change, and it's not going to change quickly, because as you'll remember, Bill Clinton promised us he was going to bring us health care and campaign finance reform. Well, what did he bring us?
Going back to what you said earlier, I don't think the US was wrong in arming Israel with nuclear weapons, because they're a country of 4 million people, surrounded by 200 million Arabs. This is no offense to anyone here, but when Arabs go at war, they don't fight just war. For them it's like a holy war, it's like some jihad or something. They would just run over these 4 million people.
Okay, and so instead the Israelis run over them.
And you said these people are jerks, or these Arab royal family, they're jerks. Jerks don't have a right to nuclear weapons. It's good they don't have them.
Well, you've got a point, but I wasn't suggesting that we continue to support the jerks. If you know something about oppression in India, you know something about occupation. I'm not saying that it's going to be a good world. I said that the intellectuals of the Arab world are telling me that even those corrupt jerks, even those governments that are in the American pocket, are going to be pushed by their own internal political dynamics, and by the... Just because you're the president of Egypt doesn't mean, and just because the military supports you doesn't mean that there aren't pressures on you. It doesn't mean that there aren't social and political pressures. The Egyptian military is divided. The Egyptian military would like to develop weapons because it's not sure the peace is going to hold. What happens if the peace doesn't hold? What happens if there's terrorism, some of it starting from Egypt? What happens if the Israelis decide to attack again? They've done it before. The Israelis have bombed Cairo before. So what I'm suggesting is that if the current situation continues, we're going to find ourselves 25 years from now with an Arab world and an Israeli world armed to the teeth, with hate and revenge in the air, with a young generation of Palestinians that's going to be far more radical in the next generation than... Here's a Palestinian who was living there. She's been smiling about most of what I've been saying. She's not radical at all. She doesn't want any of this to happen, but would you agree with me that this generation of young Palestinians is being radicalized far more than your generation was?
I would agree with you. It's a lot, it comes from a lot of frustration.
And hopelessness. I mean, when you lose hope for a life, then you just go crazy and do whatever, just to hurt.
And to make your cause known. And to make your cause known.
Plus you have to understand a lot of the Palestinians now, as it stands, have nothing further to lose. They
have lost it all.
So what's a life? If you don't have anything to live for, what's a life? They'd rather, the way they look at it is that sacrifice their life, and maybe this will make life better for the rest of the Palestinians.
Right. Who is the hero of Gaza? When Yahya Ayash was killed in January, they had the biggest outpouring of popular sentiment at his funeral that Gaza had ever seen. Even Yasser Arafat was forced to go to the home of Ayash, who he had helped kill. It was his own people who gave the Israelis the information to do it. But even Yasser Arafat had to go to the home to sort of pay homage to the martyr. And then what happened? You know, Perez thinks that he's real smart. Well, Perez killed Ayash a few weeks before the Palestinian elections, quote-unquote elections. Where did the terror bombings come from? There had been a 6-month moratorium. There had been sort of an unwritten deal between Hamas and the Israelis that if Hamas people weren't targeted, Hamas wasn't going to do what it was doing before, or certainly not in the way it was doing it before. Ayash was killed. 2 months later, bombs are going off on Israeli buses in Tel Aviv. It was preordained. I can give you journalist after journalist who wrote in the days after Ayash's killing. There's a quote, it's a very short one. Here it is. When Ayash was killed, this is what one of the sheikhs, I don't know him, Sheikh Nafez Azam said. He said, "There is blood in our mouths which we want to spit in the face of this unjust world." That's exactly what they did. That's what the bombings were all about. But your major point I agree with. It'll be a very scary world when these corrupt, and it'll be a more scary world than it is now when they develop weapons of mass destruction, and or when there's a revolution in their country and the people who take over the country decide that they now have to arm themselves against their enemy. That's why I'm suggesting we better start talking about justice, and we better start talking about real democracy and real human rights before we live in the world that you suggested would be a pretty awful one.
You thought it is fair that Israel, because there are 4 million people, should have atomic bombs, while their neighbors should not.
It keeps 200 million people in check.
What?
It keeps 200 million people in check.
But how long do you think Israel has been there? How old do you think Israel is?
50 years ago.
50, yes. There was no Israel before that. Israel was imposed on the Arab world. It was imposed on the Arab world. They made Palestinians leave their homes so the Israelis could take them. Is that a just and fair deal? Do you believe that is a fair and just deal?
I don't know what happened in that time.
Well, I'm telling you what happened. I'm asking you, do you believe this is a just deal? If somebody came and took your home from you and said, I wanted to get out, do you think that's just? That's what happened to the Palestinians. Can't you get that through your heads? Yeah, you see, you have never heard of what really happened in Palestine. That's why.
But then how do you expect people to want to fix things when people are being scrutinized for having views from what we've been presented with? If I tell you that there are 50 countries in the world, but there's 100, but you only know there's 50 countries, how can you scrutinize, how can you be scrutinized for what you don't know? We only know what we are told.
Yes.
I've never lived in Palestine, I've never lived in Israel. I don't know what happens until I read, and I'm not ignorant.
Now, when you heard this lecture today, what did you think?
Oh, that's a dangerous question.
Yes, but you have been faced with that. When I say what you are saying, they look at me and think I'm mad, I'm crazy. Where did this woman come from?
But see, I don't
Because
think
it is so unbelievable.
Now we're going to get the answer to the question.
I'm telling you, okay, I may not agree with his views.
But these are not views, these are facts he's telling you.
Right,
They are not
but his views on how to resolve conflict are his views. But I knew that before I came here, but I chose to come and listen to his side anyway. So I'm not ignorant. So his views, what he thinks, are what he is told. He didn't know when Israel began. I mean, if you're not presented with the facts, how can you comment on something? It's only ignorance if you aren't willing to listen. I may not agree.
I agree with her. Look at when I was your age, the first writing job I had was for the American Zionist Youth Foundation. And they paid me to write articles for university students on the subject of Zionism, which they sent out to university students. Now, when the '73 war broke out, I was in law school. And I was representing the international student movement for the UN, as I told you, at UN headquarters and going to law school. And I was friends with a man who's been in the news since, Yasushi Akashi, who was the head of the UN Bosnian mission. At the time, he was an undersecretary general in charge of youth affairs. I was youth. The war broke out. He and I had dinner, and he expressed to me views far milder than the views I've expressed to you today. And I was outraged. And I went back to my dorm room at NYU, and we still had typewriters, those things, you had to use whiteout. I don't feel that old, but the world's changed a lot. And I wrote him a 9-paged, single-spaced letter expressing outrage at how he could say that about Israel, about how his facts were wrong, about didn't he realize that the Jewish people were in danger of being destroyed, and blah, blah, on and on and on and on. And this got published and sent around by a number of organizations. I was, at the time, what I had been told. I was a nice American Jew. I'd only been once or twice to the Middle East. All my family had always supported Israel. I'd always been told we Jews didn't do bad things. 25 years later, you and I meet, we sit here, we talk. How can I condense 150 trips to the region? How can I condense sitting in refugee camps hearing stories about 1947? How can I condense poems that make you cry? Friends who break down in tears. Israeli friends, not Palestinian friends. Israeli friends who we sit and cry with each other about what the Jewish people have become and what the oppression is doing to us, turning us into good Jews, like we used to talk about the good Germans. You know, and how can I condense things like that? Just one story, because I think these human stories are what really make people different. So I'm sitting there watching the news at 6:30 at night. The Israelis are about to invade Lebanon, and I break down in tears. And who am I sitting with? I'm sitting with a Palestinian woman who's educated me about, she's got her arm around me, she's comforting me. Her people are being destroyed by my people. Why in the world isn't she in tears and I'm not comforting her? And she taught me a lesson that I've never forgotten. She said, I'll tell you what the reason is. Because when I was born a Palestinian. We've been oppressed and killed and bombed and lied about every day of my life. This is nothing new to me. They did it here, there, everywhere. She said, remember that story I told you that when I was a teenager I went to the Soviet Union, there was a delegation of Palestinians? And remember how I told you that I think all or most or maybe everyone on that delegation is already dead. I'm the only Palestinian who's still alive. And she said, so for me, I'm not shocked. This is what we expect. But for you, you're the nice Jewish boy from Duluth. You grew up believing that America was this great country that didn't do any evil, that Israel was this wonderful country, that Jews wouldn't kill and torture and rape and maim and destroy and drop napalm. You believed all those myths, and you believed things that you've now learned in your experience are not true. And now you see what's being done to us in your lifetime on television, right in front of your eyes, and you hear about tank commanders resigning, and the world is up in arms, and the Americans are going to save Yasser Arafat, but it looks like the Israelis are going to invade anyway. So you break down in tears, and I comfort you. Well, you don't forget things like that. So I see you're sincere. You've eaten from one series of newspapers and articles, and I mean, can you imagine people blown up to bits and destroyed and the terrorism? But I think you only have credibility to grieve if you also grieved when American airplanes flew over Palestinian camps with Israeli pilots and dropped bombs in the middle of civilian refugee camps, or when thousands of people were massacred with knives and machetes with Israeli searchlights, with Israeli army searchlights leading the way for the Lebanese phalange to go and conduct the slaughter. So if we're going to grieve, and let's grieve, boy, there's plenty to grieve about, you can't just grieve for one without grieving for the other. And my fear is that this is not over. My fear is this is a lull. This is like, you know, the eye of the storm. It's relatively quiet at the moment. It doesn't seem that there's a war in the air. But how much would it take for there to be a war? A revolution in Jordan, a revolution in Egypt, the assassination of Yasser Arafat, further development of missile technology by the Syrians, the Iranians actually developing a nuclear bomb. How far really are we from another war? I don't think necessarily that far.
It wasn't until Israel was created.
Oh, really?
It really, no, it's not the people. Not the people, they are not. No.
I certainly don't want to get into it with you.
Yes, you don't, of course. I mean, well, we were under the Ottoman Empire for 500 years, and then the French, the English. I mean, we never had a chance.
No, wait, let's talk about violence. Wait a minute.
Everything will be at peace in the Middle East.
Let's talk about violence. The greatest wars of our lifetime, our father's lifetime, recent history, recent world history, it was Christian Europe that sent millions of men to the slaughter in World War I in trench lines. It was Christian Germany that developed ovens and death camps and sent millions of Jews and Germans in playing to violin music into the death camps. So the Arabs are no more inherently violent than anybody else, but if you're subjected to huge amounts of oppression over a long period of time and you're corrupted in your political system, our Civil War, look what we did to ourselves. You know, political conditions that are intolerable or that lead to conflict can result in terrible things happening. We almost the Russians and the Americans almost had a nuclear war over Cuba.
Yes, and Europeans worked their way out of these problems.
And the Middle Easterners will also be able to work their way out, but not if we continue to oppress them.
You give the impression that the conflict in the Middle East is determined by Israel, when in fact there are many reasons why there's conflict.
I think I said it was.
Conflict of all kinds in the Middle East.
I think I've given the impression that it's created largely by the United States. This woman has largely focused on Israel, which I agree with a lot of what she's saying, but I've said the conflict is mostly perpetuated by the American empire's desire to control the region through a divide and rule strategy, which keeps everybody fighting each other. And it's an effective strategy which has been used in other parts of the world. So, you know, at this particular time in history, it looks like the Arabs are the violent people. A generation ago, the Europeans were massacring each other on battle lines. It wasn't that long ago that we were getting ready to kill, 50 million Russians over weapons in Cuba, and they were getting ready to nuke us. Yeah. So all I'm saying is this idea that Arabs are somehow more inherent. If anything, you're going to disagree with this, but if anything, my experience.
Simplifying what's happening here. It's getting back to reading the simplification of why there's conflict.
You can't have a 1 hour or 2 hour meeting without condensing and simplifying. But if anything, my experience in the Middle East has taught me, and this you obviously don't seem to agree with, my experience has taught me in the Middle East that the Arabs are far less violent, that they put up with things that are intolerable, that they've been pressed and pressed and pressed, and they're finally, as I said, I don't recall in the early years of my visits to the Middle East, and that's just my lifetime, 25 years, half of my lifetime. I don't recall hearing about suicide bombers. I don't recall hearing about this kind of thing. There was very little of that. The Egypt that I visited when I first went there as a student, petty theft was all there was. There was hardly even murder in a city like Cairo. But you create intolerable conditions, you create intolerable oppression, you create political arrangements that are unjust and unfair, maldistribution of income, maldistribution of political power, and people react.
Yes, I have no doubt that that's true. I'm just saying that all of that you just described is not determined simply by the history of Western intervention in the Middle East. I'm saying people, countries, cultures are also responsible for their own fate.
I mean, the West has intervened in the Middle East for hundreds of years. I mean,
they are responsible, but his major point is important. They are responsible for their own fate, and that's why they are saying to American Army, American CIA, please get out of here. We're responsible for our fate. Now, what if we were occupied? What would our reaction be? We were occupied once. It didn't take us very long to get those redcoats to get out of here.
Just let a problem on one side of the world just ignore it and just let them work it out. That's impossible for our economic reasons. That's impossible for humanistic reasons.
Well, then either we better be prepared to have the staying power of an empire and to perpetuate oppression over a long period of time, or we better realize that there will be a price to be paid, and maybe in fact we're beginning to see what the price is. We have a Washington in which you can't even drive by the White House because they had to close Pennsylvania Avenue. We have a State Department that is now an armed fortress. We have a Congress where you can't even drive in and see the Congress because they had to put up barriers. We have airports where they go on alert and we can't even check our bags without being asked all kinds of questions. Now, we put up with it because we're a very organized society and we have a lot of technological means at our disposal to handle these things. But this is only the beginning. Tell me what happens if you're a real terrorist, if you really want to hurt the United States. Do you really think that the barriers in front of the White House are going to stop you? I'll tell you exactly what you do. You go rent a tuxedo, you go find an attractive girl, you buy 2 tickets to the Kennedy Center, you drive underneath Kennedy Center, you go upstairs, you walk out the front door, you go over to the Watergate and you order a cognac, and your car blows up underneath. There's no security checks. There's a million places in Washington or anywhere in this country that determined terrorists could harm the United States. And my strong suspicion is this next generation of Arabs, if it comes to that, if things don't change, will decide that just blowing themselves up with sticks of TNT is not the only thing that they can do. You're shaking your head. I don't know, is that agreement or disagreement?
That's scary. It's scary. I mean, it's...
I know it's scary, but do you agree or disagree?
Contemplate.
But do you agree or disagree?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Okay, so if we don't want this world,
that can happen, yeah.
if we don't want this world, and what the Israelis want is an Islamic Western conflict. That's what they want. I can read you quotes from Peace Now Israelis telling you that the new war is between Islamic radicalism and the civilized world. The purpose is to foment a Western Islamic divide. Why? Because if they do that, then they, Israel, can be the American bastion of democracy and freedom and military strength. That's not a good world for the United States. It's not a good world to contemplate revolution from Algeria to Pakistan and maybe further. At the moment, India is pretty stable, but it's stable also because it uses all kinds of oppression in Kashmir, and you know, it's not an empire that necessarily is going to stick together.
Do you think the conflict in the Middle East is like merged with the religion, because of the religion, like different sects of Muslims and this and that, whatever?
No, I think this...
Patriotism has never given a practical solution to any problem.
What was that last part?
As far as Kashmir is concerned, whatever Israel and Palestine, patriotism never gives a practical solution to any problem.
You're using the word victorism or...
Patriotism. Patriotism.
Oh, patriotism.
We never get a practical solution out of it. I can also be very passionate about it.
I didn't say that the solutions, if you create a terrible mess, sometimes cleaning up the mess is a lot more difficult after the mess was created than before the mess was created. So now that we've made this mess of all these groups fighting each other, of all these royal families, of all this corruption, of all this despair, it's going to be more difficult to deal with it than it would have been to deal with it before. But what are the choices? Should we just make the mess bigger and bigger and bigger until it becomes totally unsolvable? Should we just allow Israel to be the bastion of nuclear weapons in the Middle East and expect the Arabs year after year after year after year to put up with whatever the Israelis do?
I mean, if Israel decides to blow up everybody else, what has she left? I mean, they can't live in the wilderness then.
Well, we were prepared to do it too. I mean, we were going to start a nuclear war over Cuba because the Israelis are not the only Samson power around. But what time is it? I think we've overstayed our welcome. One more question. We have time for one more question. Some student must have some dying question that they want to ask. Now, come on. Well, we don't have one more question.
In that case, thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.